and help you even further substantiate what you're suggesting we be inspired by or impressed by from the Kantian thought. It relates to his third critique, and where, if looking from the argument in the first and second, it would appear that it is most important the role of reason, as you've given to us, and particularly for dealing with the subjective elements. But I wonder if a broadening of the horizons might ultimately come forth from a serious study of the third critique of judgment that would broaden out the worldview that he's proposing and that comes forth from the first and second, and rests too much just on morality itself, but begins to encompass some of the factors that have not only been brought out in your talk, but in this conference at a very great depth, and through these broader horizons enable us to address very different questions raised philosophically that might perhaps resolve some of the problems of a dappled world.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you for the, not just the kind words, but also the pointing to further ways of supporting it and extending it. I think now I want, not exactly take back, but make a little bit more precise one of the points that I was making. I definitely did stress the importance of the moral order for the other orders. I think what I want to do, though, is say that there is a kind of distinct need of reason that is driving each of the three critiques, so that it's the moral need of practical reason that's driving the second critique. In the first critique, though, he's obviously very interested in making sure that morality still ends up being not exactly possible, but not impossible. But the argument that I focused on was really about how to explain the theoretical possibility of the object of science, say, or of everyday experience as well. And so that argument wasn't really directed explicitly at the moral need of reason. That was a more theoretical need. And then in the third critique, this is why your question was quite helpful, because I sometimes made it sound as if the third critique is really all and only about preserving the moral need, and that's not quite right. That is part of it, certainly, but I think that what he's up to in the third critique, this came out in maybe an indirect way in response to Martha's question, is he's looking for a system of laws that would explain, well, all of the empirical world, right? Because in the third critique, he's interested not just in determinative judgment, but also in regulative judgment, and that leads him to focus on not just those laws that are sort of metaphysically necessary, but all the other kinds of laws that we might have with all their empirical content. But once you've got all the empirical content, then you have to think about, well, how should that empirical content be structured rationally, right? And so if we find out different laws, I think what he's interested in is figuring out what sort of dependency relationship obtains amongst those laws. And so what he's really looking for, in a sense, is an ideal science. And so that's a distinct kind of need that our reason has. It's touched on in the first critique in certain ways, but in the argument that I was presenting, that wasn't its primary focus. And so I think in the third critique, it does unite the first two critiques in a certain sense, because he's showing how the moral order and the scientific order really do cohere well with each other. And I mean, that's very sunny, very optimistic kind of picture. But I mean, I think it's nice to have this kind of philosophical ideal that one could use in one's orientation and thinking about, okay, so how are we doing, right? I mean, I'm happy with this little theory that I've got and that little theory. You know, could I possibly put these together? And what would it take? Well, sometimes it's helpful to have grand systems worked out. Even if you don't buy all sorts of features of the particular systems, at least you know, oh, well, that would be a great thing to have, or something like that would be a great thing to have. So, and I think we do have pretty ambitious goals in that regard with respect to the project. And Nancy and others have done a lot of work on the contemporary side, so I'm hoping that this is a kind of historical suggestion. So thank you for your question.
Andrew?
Thanks. I just wanted to say a couple things about the possibility proof, and then maybe sound a note of East Coast gray, dour pessimism in response to some of the sunny West Coast optimism. Just in response to Tim's question, one thing you could say, I would have thought, is that the kind of harmony relations between some of the possibilities themselves need to be grounded. So it has to, I mean, Des is talking about real possibility this morning. The fact that some of these possibilities can themselves be instantiated together, the fact that that is possible itself needs some sort of a ground. So you might be able to go for a single ground in that way that would be a little bit more impressive than just a economy argument. But I was curious about why you thought that in general this argument doesn't, it seems like you say, at least in the ideal chapter in the first critique, doesn't get you a personified God. I'm not sure what personified means there exactly, but it does look as though he thinks explicitly that you have to ground predicates like intellect and will, and that no other grounds, that those are not going to be the consequences or derivative kind of predicates that you can get from some other more fundamental ground. So it looks like there's some reason in the argument to think that you're going to get intellect and will. Maybe that's not sufficient for personality, or maybe it's not sufficient for moral personality. That might be something to consider, but it does seem like you get at least a lot of the personal properties from the argument itself. So just two things to say on behalf of the argument. The larger kind of pessimistic comment about the whole story here, I was thinking, there's a sense in which, I mean, I'm sympathetic to this, of course, but I'm playing devil's advocate. All the talk about reasons, needs, and so forth could strike somebody as special pleading. I mean, it's one thing to have a transcendental argument where something we do, science or morality, just requires kind of deductively that we postulate certain beings or commit ourselves to certain kind of underwriting principles. I think in a way, part of the project here is to look and see if we can find any such arguments in the moderns. Kant, it seems like, has this ambivalence or ambiguous kind of approach to this. On the one hand, he's famous for anti-metaphysical arguments, as you're pointing out, doesn't think that any of them are demonstrative and doesn't want to go down those rationalist roads, but retains a kind of rationalist sympathy that's spelled out in terms of our rational needs, or if we're going to be inquirers, there's a sense in which we want to think that there are some ultimate explanations at the bottom here. And I just wonder what we can say in response to a kind of more Humean picture that would say, extirpate these needs or stop. In a way, Kant takes seriously your claim that reason continually pushes us to go beyond what we're supposed to go beyond, and admit that with a kind of Humean picture of the laws and less rationalism held over from your past, we can do science and maybe even morality just fine without appealing to some of these other underlying kinds of metaphysical grounds.
Yeah, thanks for at least three different really good questions. I was trying to abstract from whether the harmonious relations that might obtain between certain distinct possibilities, whether that is a special kind of real harmony or just a kind of normal logical kind. I mean, one might just think that, well, in God's mind, he's thinking of just one possibility, the whole world, and everything's included in it. So the real harmony between that one possibility and what? That's sort of all self-contained. But I recognize you've got that position that you're pushing, and if you need it, sure, I think there might be other ways of going there. On your second point, yeah, I mean, this is a difficult issue, which is, so why wouldn't the being that's established in this argument that I focus on in the first critique, why wouldn't that already not be personified if it's the ens realissimum has all realities, and if will and intellect are realities, then God would have to have them. I mean, I think there are 2 points. One is that's why I had that one passage where he explicitly says that God doesn't will the possibilities, right? So however it is that he grounds those possibilities, which is an important and difficult issue that some of us worked on, it isn't through willing, right? But if it isn't through willing, then how can it really be required that the being that grounds those things has to have a will if the will isn't involved in the grounding of them?
Because the very possibility of will is
But it might be had without being through exemplification at this point, which is a familiar issue we've had. The other thing is that I guess I think that it's not so clear how robust of a conception you've got if you're just applying the unschematized categories. So what conception of willing do you really have if that's it? Because at least in certain passages, it looks like he thinks that, oh, well, if you're talking about willing in any sort of robust way, then it involves desire, which is an empirical concept. And so if that's what you mean by willing, which is almost always what we do mean by willing, then you wouldn't be able to attribute that notion to this sort of bare minimum of God. And then the last question, well, that's obviously a big issue. And note that I didn't say that Kant's project is the only project, right? I mean, I said the Humean picture is, as far as I can tell, a consistent picture. And elsewhere I've suggested, at least argued, who knows, that Kant doesn't have a sort of definitive refutation such that there are no ways out for the Humean. I mean, maybe the bullets they have to bite are considerable, but if they're willing to do it, they can do it. And and I, in some sense, was just trying to point out that, well, there are other options that one can pursue. And so part of my answer to your last question is just, well, there are a lot of projects that one can pursue, and I guess in an indirect kind of way, in sort of in a very metaphilosophical way, I want to say, well, once you have these different options on the table, then you have a better perspective on what might be missing in the strictly narrowly empiricist conception, right? So that the empiricist might think, oh, I'm doing just fine because I've set up my expectations according to what I'm trying to do, and then somebody else comes along and says, well, there are other things that you could do, and once you see what those other things are, you could maybe be less happy than you were. So this is the non-optimistic note coming from here. Maybe you shouldn't quite be as happy as you are. So that leads to something better in the end. So in my
Okay, one last question in the back. If any of you need to leave right away for the airport, please don't feel bad about sneaking out.